On February 10th, 2019, while most people in Colchester were going about their evening as usual, two men, Carl Hopkins and Jon Birch, were in a much more desperate situation. Both were part of the local homeless community and had long been dealing with the daily difficulties of addiction and life on the streets. That Sunday night, their focus had narrowed entirely to one thing: getting drugs. They were in urgent need of money, and that urgency pushed them to make a decision that would have serious consequences. They decided to rob a drug dealer. This wasn't something they rushed into. They came up with the plan while under a lot of pressure. The man they targeted was someone known in the area for being involved in drug dealing. Carl and Jon walked toward Graffiti Alley, a place often used for illegal activities, its walls covered in layers of spray paint. As they made their way through the city, they talked carefully about what they were about to do. They planned who would speak first, how they would confront the dealer, and what steps each of them would take to make sure they got either drugs or money. They also thought about what could go wrong, how the dealer might react, and how to deal with it if things didn't go smoothly. Everything about their plan came from a place of deep desperation, and by the time they reached their meeting point in the alley, they had talked through the details in quiet voices. Not long after they arrived, the drug dealer showed up. He was described as a black man and seemed to expect a normal transaction. As soon as he stepped into the alley, Jon Birch acted. Sticking to their plan, he quickly grabbed the dealer from behind and put him in a headlock, trying to bring him down fast and stop him from fighting back. He pulled the man to the ground, onto the cold surface of the alley. The dealer didn't go down easily. He started fighting hard, doing everything he could to break free. The struggle between them turned into a physical fight in the narrow space. Then things escalated fast. The dealer pulled out a knife. The second that weapon appeared, everything changed. What had started as a robbery became a dangerous and violent fight. Jon, now facing serious danger, tried to protect himself. He had a broken wine bottle with sharp edges and used it to try to stop the man with the knife, or at least hurt him enough to get away. While this fight went on, Carl didn't join in. Even though they had planned it together, once the knife came out, Carl stayed to the side and didn't help. This decision later raised questions, especially because of how suddenly and violently things had changed. The fight continued, and the knife kept coming at Jon. He ended up getting stabbed several times. Later, medical reports would confirm how serious his injuries were. In the middle of all this, Jon managed to say something to the attacker. He told him, "Stop stabbing me, or I'll stab you." It wasn't a threat so much as a desperate attempt to survive, as he kept trying to defend himself with the broken bottle. After that, something unexpected happened. The dealer let Jon go. Even with his injuries, Jon got up and ran, trying to escape the alley. But the attacker didn't leave right away. He went after Jon, chasing him for a short distance. During that brief moment, Carl Hopkins, who had stayed out of the fight, ended up directly in the attacker's path. The wounds Carl received were fatal and showed that the attack had been quick and deliberate. After injuring Carl and possibly seeing Jon run off, the attacker finally left the scene. He disappeared into the night, leaving behind two victims and the signs of a violent struggle. It wasn't long before the scene was discovered. Carl Hopkins was found dead on the ground. Jon Birch was nearby, badly hurt and bleeding, but still alive. Police responded quickly. Officers secured the alley to preserve any evidence. Paramedics confirmed Carl was dead and rushed Jon to the hospital after stabilizing him. He had survived the stabbing even though the wounds were serious. One of the first important clues noticed by police was a clear blood trail leaving the alley. It was strong and easy to follow, showing that the attacker had also been injured during the fight. That blood trail led out of the alley and into the streets of Colchester, giving detectives a clear direction as they began working to track down the person who had committed the stabbing. The investigation into what happened in Graffiti Alley started immediately, but from the beginning, detectives faced major difficulties. The inquiry was officially named Operation Cromwell. One of the biggest problems came from the nature of the crime scene and the people involved. Carl Hopkins and Jon Birch were both members of Colchester's homeless population, a group that often feels disconnected from society and rarely trusts the police. That mistrust combined with the risks that come with the illegal drug trade, made it very hard for investigators to get useful information. Detectives quickly found that people who might have seen something were very hesitant to talk. Many of them were afraid of being targeted for speaking out. There was a strong fear of being labeled a snitch, which made people keep quiet even if they had helpful information. This silence was driven by both fear and a need to stay safe. As a result, it was difficult to gather clear leads in the early stages. Police did many interviews and searched the area around Graffiti Alley. They visited shelters and spoke with social workers, trying to make contact with anyone who might help. But even with all these efforts, progress was slow. Every bit of information had to be carefully verified because misleading or false statements were also common. With so few solid witness accounts, investigators had to depend heavily on forensics and standard police work to move the case forward. Despite all of this, things changed when an anonymous tip came in. The person who gave the tip did not give their name, but the information they shared gave the investigation new direction. According to the tipster, a black drug dealer had been responsible for attacking both Carl Hopkins and Jon Birch. The caller also described the suspect in a very specific way, saying he was light and big. This meant the suspect likely had lighter skin and a large build. That detail gave investigators something concrete to work with. It allowed them to focus their efforts on looking for people in the local drug scene who matched that description. This one piece of information became the major turning point, shifting the investigation from a general search into a focused effort. At the crime scene, the clearest piece of physical evidence was the blood trail. Investigators made the careful decision to follow this trail starting at Graffiti Alley. It took time and required careful attention to preserve the evidence. Often, the work was done at night or very early in the morning, when it would be easier to keep the scene undisturbed. Forensic officers used tools like luminol to detect every trace of blood. They followed the drops and smears as they continued through nearby streets and alleyways. The trail showed that whoever was bleeding had moved quickly, but left behind enough of a path to be tracked. Eventually, the trail led them to a specific place, a home in Taylor Court. This location was close to Graffiti Alley and quickly became a key focus of the investigation. It suggested that either the suspect lived there or had gone there to hide or get help after the attack. When police arrived at the address in Taylor Court, they acted quickly and carried out a raid on the property. They entered expecting to find the wounded suspect inside. But when they got in, they found that he had already left. The home was empty of the person they were looking for. What they did find was a messy and cluttered space, which some officers described as looking like a junk store. This gave the impression of a disorganized or temporary living arrangement. Even though the suspect was gone, the home had many possible pieces of evidence. Police collected drinking cups and a large number of cigarette butts. While these might seem like everyday items, investigators knew they could hold DNA or fingerprints. If matched, these materials could directly connect the suspect to that address and to the crime. The fact that the suspect had run from the home made the police even more certain they were following the right lead. With the suspect gone, attention shifted to a careful forensic search of the Taylor Court home. Experts in evidence collection went over everything inside, looking closely for anything that might help. Since the trail of blood from Graffiti Alley had led directly there, they brought in a blood detection dog. This dog had already been used to follow the trail earlier and was trained to locate even very small or cleaned-up traces of blood. The dog's handler guided it through the property, and the dog eventually stopped and gave a positive signal. It had found something important, a wet sponge hidden behind a sink. This discovery suggested the suspect had tried to clean up after the attack, possibly washing himself or the weapon. The sponge was taken in immediately as key forensic evidence. All the physical evidence from the investigation, including blood samples from Graffiti Alley, material from the Taylor Court address, the sponge, and the cigarette ends, was sent straight to the lab for urgent testing. The time waiting for these results was tense, but it didn't take long before a major development came through. The lab sent what they called a hot update, meaning the results were extremely important and needed immediate attention. The testing showed a DNA match. The same person's blood had been found at both the crime scene and at the Taylor Court home. That person was already in the police database. This gave the investigators exactly what they needed: a name and direct forensic proof connecting the suspect to both locations. But right after this breakthrough, something unexpected created confusion. When police looked up the DNA profile, they found a problem in the system. The suspect's DNA had been entered twice. One of those entries had a note saying the suspect had a Lithuanian twin who also had a scar on his temple, just like the main suspect. This strange detail caused a delay because detectives had to investigate whether there really was a twin. The idea that there might be another person with identical DNA and the same unique scar raised new questions. Police had to dig into the suspect's records and confirm the truth. Fortunately, the issue was cleared up quickly. It turned out to be an error in how the information had been entered into the system. There was no twin. Once this was corrected, investigators could move forward, fully confident in the DNA match. They now had the suspect's identity, proof of his connection to the attack, and evidence showing where he had gone after it happened. Once the DNA results were confirmed and the confusion about the so-called twin was resolved, Operation Cromwell moved forward more quickly. Detectives were now certain of the suspect's identity, and the top priority became finding and arresting him. A dedicated team was assigned to build a full picture of the suspect, which meant reviewing a large amount of CCTV footage. They searched through hours of video from cameras around Colchester. The earlier anonymous tip had described the suspect as a light and big black male, and now that description matched the person confirmed by DNA. Investigators focused on footage from the areas around Graffiti Alley, Taylor Court, and nearby streets, looking for anyone who matched that appearance and had been in the area at the right time. This was detailed, time-consuming work that required officers to go through frame after frame, looking for clues in faces, clothing, and even body movements. While reviewing this footage, the team made significant progress. They found clear images of both Carl Hopkins and Jon Birch before the attack. These clips confirmed where they had been and what they were doing in the hours leading up to the incident. The footage also showed Carl Hopkins again after he had been fatally wounded, offering key visual evidence of the immediate aftermath of the attack in Graffiti Alley. However, identifying the suspect on camera remained difficult. The attacker did not appear clearly in the video, or his movements were not captured in a way that allowed for a clear visual match. This meant that, despite having strong DNA evidence, the police still lacked a visual confirmation of the suspect's presence during the attack, at least through the camera footage they had at that point. The real turning point came not from fixed surveillance, but from direct police observation. A surveillance officer spotted someone walking just a few streets away from Taylor Court who closely fit the description given, specifically, a black male who was light and big. This sighting, made by a trained officer, was taken seriously. Once the team confirmed that the person matched the general profile, they began following him carefully. The officers kept their distance and tracked his movements without drawing attention. Eventually, the suspect entered a nearby community center. This location, being a public and controlled space, gave the officers a safe opportunity to act. They decided it was the right moment to make the arrest. Police moved in and took the suspect into custody. He was identified as a juvenile and was arrested on suspicion of murder in connection with Carl Hopkins's death and of causing serious bodily harm to Jon Birch. Officers carried out the arrest by the book, informing the juvenile of his right to remain silent and his right to have a lawyer. Even though formal questioning hadn't started yet, the suspect immediately made what police referred to as significant comments. These were spontaneous statements given at the time of arrest that officers believed could be important, either as a denial or as a form of early explanation. The specific words he used weren't made public at that point, but investigators understood right away that what he said could matter later. After the arrest, the juvenile was taken to the police station to begin the standard custody process. A custody sergeant oversaw his arrival and made sure all procedures were followed properly. This included documenting the suspect's personal belongings and making note of his condition. Because the suspect was underage, the law required that an appropriate adult be present during questioning and some other parts of the custody process. This rule is meant to make sure juveniles understand what's happening and that their rights are protected. While going through this early stage, officers noticed the suspect had a visible injury on his temple. When asked about it, he brushed it off, saying it was just an accident. Even so, detectives made note of it as something important. A head injury could support Jon Birch's description of the struggle and could provide more forensic evidence showing the suspect had been involved in the violent fight in Graffiti Alley. Police then reached out to the suspect's family. His father was contacted and told over the phone that his son had been arrested for murder. The seriousness of the charge was clear, and it was likely the father had no warning or idea that his son was involved in such a serious case. After the call, plans were made for the father to come to the station. A solicitor was also brought in to represent the juvenile during questioning. This step ensured the legal process was being followed correctly and that the suspect would have proper legal support for the next part of the investigation. Everything was now in place to continue collecting evidence and to hear directly from the suspect in a formal setting. With the young suspect now held in custody and represented by a lawyer, the investigation entered the important stage of interviews. Detectives working under Operation Cromwell were eager to hear his version of what happened in Graffiti Alley. However, when the questioning began, the suspect followed legal advice and said, "No comment" to every question. This was a common strategy used by defense teams, especially when the police had not yet shared the full details of their case. The reason for this approach was to avoid saying anything that could accidentally weaken the suspect's position before his legal team had seen all the evidence. The silence was not an admission of guilt, but a way to protect the suspect's legal standing. Because of this, the detectives had to focus on the evidence they had, rather than hoping for a confession early on. The police, on their side, used their own strategy when presenting the evidence. Instead of giving everything to the defense right away, they released the information bit by bit. This method allowed them to watch how the suspect responded to specific pieces of evidence as they were introduced. By holding back some key facts, the officers hoped to catch changes or inconsistencies in the suspect's account. Every scientific report and witness account was timed carefully for maximum effect during the questioning. This back and forth between slowly shared evidence and repeated interview sessions became the shape of the next phase of the investigation. As more interviews were conducted, the scientific evidence kept growing stronger. Blood found both at the scene in Graffiti Alley and at the suspect's temporary residence in Taylor Court came back as a DNA match. In addition to that, his fingerprints were found, making the connection even more direct. With this kind of evidence stacking up, the defense team began to see that the silence approach would not hold up much longer and might even cause more harm later on. They decided to submit a prepared statement on the suspect's behalf. This allowed them to explain his side of the story without putting him through live questioning. It gave the defense control over what was said and how it was presented, shaping a version of events they felt was more favorable. In this written statement, the suspect clearly denied both the murder of Carl Hopkins and the attempted murder of Jon Birch. He gave his account of the night, saying he went to Graffiti Alley for a drug deal. He claimed that when he got there, two men came at him right away. He described one of them as having a covered face and carrying a weapon. According to him, he was immediately grabbed and put in a headlock, and he said he was hit in the head during the struggle that followed. He said he feared for his life and thought he was being robbed. Because of this, he admitted to pulling out a knife to defend himself and escape. He finished the statement by saying he had no plan or intention to hurt anyone. His position was that he was the real victim and was only trying to protect himself from serious harm. After reading this version of events, the detectives moved quickly to challenge it. They raised a number of serious questions about the truth of the statement. They asked why the suspect had waited so long to explain his story if he really was the victim. They pointed out that he never called emergency after allegedly running from a dangerous situation. They also focused on the knife, which had not been recovered, asking why it was missing. Another issue they raised was his earlier lie about how he got the head injury that police noticed when he was first taken into custody. He had first said it was an accident, but now claimed it came from being attacked. The detectives also noticed that parts of his story matched details only the police and defense had discussed privately, like where the fight happened and the nature of the victim's injuries. This raised the possibility that the statement had been shaped to fit the known facts instead of being based on a true memory. The questioning now focused on breaking down the claim of self-defense and pushing for a clearer explanation of what really happened. Once the interviews were complete and the statement had been examined, the full set of evidence was handed over to the Crown Prosecution Service. The CPS looked carefully at everything: the forensic reports, the blood evidence, the DNA link, Jon Birch's testimony, the CCTV footage, the prepared statement from the suspect, and the early comments he made during his arrest. After reviewing all of it, the CPS made the decision to charge the juvenile suspect. He was officially charged with the murder of Carl Hopkins, attempted murder in connection with Jon Birch's injuries, and possession of a bladed article referring to the knife he had admitted to using. These charges showed that the prosecution believed the actions taken were not justified by self-defense, but instead were unlawful and intentional. The case was now ready to move forward to Crown Court. After the young suspect was officially charged, he remained in custody. This was a standard part of the process to make sure he would attend court and not interfere with the investigation. During the time between the charges being filed and his first appearance in court, there were various administrative tasks. These included discussions between his legal team, the police, and the Crown Prosecution Service to prepare for what was coming next in court. Given the seriousness of the accusations against him, the case was scheduled to be handled in a higher court. That meant several early hearings would take place before the full trial, but ultimately, the charges of murder and attempted murder would be addressed at the Crown Court. The case then moved forward and reached the stage of the Crown Court trial. The process began with selecting a jury made up of 12 people whose role was to review and weigh the evidence presented by both sides. The prosecution, feeling confident in their case, focused on the scientific findings and the testimony of Jon Birch. They described in detail the stabbing that had taken place in Graffiti Alley, the discovery of Carl Hopkins's body, and the serious injuries suffered by Jon Birch. They also talked about the blood trail that was followed from the crime scene to the suspect's temporary address at Taylor Court. A key part of their argument was the DNA evidence that matched the suspect to blood found at both locations. In addition, they submitted the prepared statement the suspect had given, which acknowledged his presence at the scene and his use of a knife, although he claimed it was in self-defense. The prosecution tried to show that what happened went well beyond protecting oneself and that the suspect either meant to kill or at least seriously injure the victims. The defense aimed to counter this by focusing on the idea that their client had acted in self-defense. They repeated what had been said in the prepared statement, claiming the suspect had gone to Graffiti Alley for a drug deal but was suddenly attacked by two individuals. They said he was put in a headlock and hit, which caused him to believe he was in serious danger. They argued that he reacted out of fear, using a knife only to escape, and had no plan or intention to harm anyone. They denied that he meant to kill Carl Hopkins or severely injure Jon Birch, insisting it was all a result of trying to get away from an attempted robbery. The defense also pointed to any unclear points in Jon Birch's testimony or issues with the timeline of the forensic evidence that might help support their version of events. The trial continued with witness testimony, expert input from forensic professionals, and full arguments from both legal teams taking place over a lengthy period. When all the evidence had been presented and both sides had made their final points, the jury went to deliberate. This part of the process brought a great deal of tension for everyone involved, especially the families of the victims and the officers who had handled the case. Eventually, the jury returned with their decisions. In the courtroom, people waited quietly as the head juror stood to announce the verdicts. On the murder charge involving Carl Hopkins, the jury found the defendant not guilty. Then, on the charge of attempted murder of Jon Birch, they also gave a not guilty verdict. This result caused disappointment and surprise among the police officers who had worked hard on the case. From their point of view, the physical evidence, the DNA match, the blood trail, and Jon Birch's testimony all clearly linked the suspect to what had happened. They believed they had enough to prove guilt and support the serious charges that had been brought. Their reactions inside the courtroom made it clear they were upset. During the trial, some officers had noticed that the jury seemed to show some kind of sympathy or even interest in the defendant. That suggested to them that the defense's story, which presented the young man as someone simply trying to protect himself during an attempted robbery, had made an impact on the jurors. It seemed the jury accepted that even though the suspect used a knife, he did so out of fear and not with the goal of harming anyone. The not guilty decisions brought the legal case to a close. Even with all the work that had gone into the investigation, the strong scientific evidence, and the serious charges brought forward, the young man was not convicted of the crimes. The result showed that the jury had not been persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt that he had intended to commit murder or attempted murder, and that they believed he may have acted only in defense. Because of this, no one would be held legally responsible for the death of Carl Hopkins or the injuries to Jon Birch. The case known as the Alleys of Colchester ended with a verdict that left police and families with unanswered questions and a lingering sense that justice might not have been done.